Imagine the scene. It's 3 a.m. in Tokyo. Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi is at her official residence, not sleeking, but awake, to retrieve a stack of briefing documents. When this news broke, the public reaction was, well, it was immediate and predictable.
This was karoshi death by overwork personified at the very highest level of government. The media and opposition politicians pounced. She was accused of forcing around 100 government employees to pull a grueling all-nighter just to cater to her. It was the perfect, damning headline.
Exactly. It confirmed every single stereotype about Japan's toxic professional life. A classic case of a workaholic leader setting a terrible example.
But then you start to look a little closer at the details of her defense.
Right. She explains she went to her residence, not the main office, specifically to avoid forcing a large staff to come in. She mentions an old, unreliable fax machine that jams after 10 pages. And then she points the finger not at her staff, but directly back at the very politicians who are accusing her.
And suddenly, what looked like a simple open and shut case of overwork starts to twist.
It stops being a story about one person's bad habits and becomes a story about a systemic power play, where the accusation of overwork is cynically used as a weapon by the very people who make it necessary.
And that is exactly the mission for this deep dive. We are peeling back the layers on Japan's culture of overwork to show that it is maintained not just by, demanding cultural norms, but by powerful entities in both the government and the economy who cynically deploy obligation and abuse of power as weapons.
So you might think this is simply about bosses forcing employees to stay late.
But the true drivers are systemic procedures and these deeply entrenched economic hierarchies. We need to investigate the political and economic systems that create these impossible deadlines, and then look at the ongoing reforms that are attempting, and often failing, to challenge these deeply rooted structures that normalize exhaustion. Let's unpack this by starting where the story began, the political theater that created the 3 a.m. incident. It is a stunning, almost perfect case study in how a bureaucracy can be forced into exhaustion, not by bad leadership, but by institutional sabotage. The initial criticism was so powerful precisely because it played into that familiar damning narrative. The headline was easy. PM Takaichi was criticized for forcing a massive staff. I think the initial estimates were around 100 people. To pull an all-nighter for a reku or a briefing. This instantly confirms the stereotype of a leader setting a grueling work-until-you-drop example for the entire nation to follow.
Right, but her counter-narrative, which, barely registered in the initial media frenzy, was meticulously detailed. She clarified that the staff wasn't there to give her a lecture, which is, a formal, time-consuming briefing session. She stated, "I received the briefing documents and read them myself." And crucially, she explained her rationale for being at the official residence, the Kute, rather than the main governmental office complex, the Kante. She chose the residence specifically to avoid forcing the mobilization of a large staff required for security and logistics at the main office.
Okay, so at the residence, she was only dealing with her immediate secretary, her security detail, and her driver.
That's it.
This changes the entire context. Her 3 a.m. movement was, by her account, an attempt at mitigating the disruption caused by some external force. The problem was logistical and procedural.
Right. She needed lengthy, sensitive documents immediately. And the vintage fax machine at the Kute, which is a whole other story about outdated tech and Japanese bureaucracy, apparently jams consistently after about 10 pages.
So she physically had to retrieve the full stack of classified documents herself from the secured location at 3 a.m. This wasn't about imposing work. It was about damage control due to, like you said, outdated infrastructure and, more importantly, a political crisis she didn't initiate. And that's where the power play comes in. She then pointed the finger at the ultimate cause: procedural abuse weaponized by the opposition parties. The only reason she needed documents at 3 a.m. was that the opposition had submitted their questions for the upcoming diet session extremely late. And we have to understand the importance of the formal rule here. For the diet session, the basic common sense requirement is 2 days advance notice for questions.
Why 2 days?
Well, it's not arbitrary. It's the minimum time required for the massive machinery of the Ministry Kasumigaseki to function. They have to dig up historical data, draft the politically sensitive answer, get multi-level consensus and approval, often requiring signatures from dozens of department heads before it can be read as official government policy.
But the reality, which is what created this structural overwork, is just Staggering. We are looking at a practice that amounts to a systematic denial of service attack on the government's ability to function efficiently.
It is. The data reveals that 80% of all questions submitted to the government miss that required 2-day deadline.
80%. So the rule is basically just for show.
It's completely ignored, and the submission times are even more malicious. Think about the strategic timing. 43%, nearly half of all these opposition questions are submitted after 6 p.m. on the day before the diet session is scheduled.
Which guarantees an all-nighter for the entire ministry staff involved. It's an intentional act to maximize chaos and minimize the quality of the government's response. Let's bring the human element back into this. Let's imagine a person on the receiving end. We'll call him Ito-san, a mid-level public servant in the Ministry of Finance, working in Kasumigaseki.
Okay. He's been there since 8 a.m. pushing papers, and it's now 9:30 p.m. He's hoping, to catch the last train home to see his children awake for maybe an hour. Ito-san has mentally clocked out. He's done his regular quota. But suddenly, an urgent question, often several urgent questions, arrives from the opposition bench minutes before the absolute cutoff, and it requires a cross-departmental response involving complex budget figures and legal precedents.
So this question, submitted late for maximum political impact, demands maximum bureaucratic attention.
Right.
Ito-san's heart just sinks. He knows instantly that he and his entire section are now shackled to their desks. They have to coordinate across 3 different ministries, draft the official legally sound answer, and then, this is the most time-consuming part, get that answer approved through the Ringy system.
Which requires physical seals, the Hanko, and signatures from several levels of management who are also completely exhausted.
He's not going home.
No. He's fueled by lukewarm coffee and obligation. By 3 a.m., when the Prime Minister is rushing to pick up the documents, the very documents Ito-san's team finalized under duress, he is beyond exhausted, participating in what is ultimately political theater designed to embarrass, not to govern.
That's the definition of the bureaucrat's burden. This procedural abuse destroys their efficiency, it breeds contempt for the political system, and it is a major cause of the severe mental health crises we see in Kasumigaseki today.
The analogy you drew earlier, the political shit talk, is incredibly illuminating here. The opposition effectively forces the entire government apparatus, from the ministries to the PM and all the support staff,
into the role of the shit-talk, the subcontractor.
Exactly. They're just taking rush orders from the political client, who in this case is the opposition.
It reveals a deep, pervasive pathology. This practice forces the government to absorb all the inefficiency, all the stress, and the physical exhaustion of the political class.
The politicians demand high-quality, fully vetted answers, but they deprive the bureaucracy of the time needed to produce them efficiently. It creates an impossible bind that is solved only through sheer, unsustainable effort.
And the irony, as you pointed out, is just the breathtaking hypocrisy. The same political parties who publicly criticize the ruling establishment for promoting an overwork environment
are the very ones whose procedural tactics created the crisis for Ito-san and his colleagues.
It's a contradiction that demands analysis. How do they rationalize this?
They use the narrative of overwork as a moral cudgel against the ruling party, saying, look at how poorly they manage their staff. But simultaneously, they rely on tactics that guarantee that exact outcome. It reveals that the political goal isn't policy clarity or staff welfare, but maximizing embarrassment and procedural gridlock.
And what's even more nuanced is the link to labor interests here. These specific opposition parties often draw significant financial and political backing from powerful labor unions.
And this creates a profound internal conflict. These labor unions publicly campaign against long hours, unfair contract terms, and oppressive tactics in the corporate world. Yet their political representatives enforce the exact same oppressive dynamic, the last-minute, non-negotiable demand that requires an all-nighter against the public servants in Kasumigaseki.
So they are applying corporate-style, superior bargaining position abuse, but within the political sphere.
It highlights that this system of compulsory, non-negotiable obligation transcends sector and ideology.
So the political system is weaponizing obligation and the demand for maximum effort to maintain power.
Okay.
It's transition. Because the political shit-talk system is, in many ways, just a mirrored reflection of a far broader, more deeply ingrained economic engine of overwork.
If we connect this back to the broader picture, the foundation of this abusive structure lies in Japan's widespread reliance on the subcontractor model. This is the shit-talk system that has been the backbone of the Japanese economy since the post-war recovery.
This is where large clients, the daikigyo, hold an overwhelmingly superior and often legally exploitable bargaining position over the small and medium-sized enterprises, the SMEs.
Right.
In most industrialized nations, supplier relationships exist, of course. But in Japan, this relationship is formalized, both economically and culturally, to allow the large client to exert disproportionate control.
And this is codified in law and culture by the concept of yuetsu teki chi no ranyu, the abuse of a superior bargaining position.
This isn't just a descriptive phrase, is it? It's a specific legal concept.
It is. It's established under competition law to prevent unfair trading practices. The concept acknowledges that even if a contract exists, if the economic power dynamic is too skewed, the stronger party can coerce the weaker party into accepting impossible, devastating terms.
The SME owner can't truly say no.
They can't, because the consequences of refusal losing the core contract mean total bankruptcy.
Let's use our analogy again. Moving from the bureaucrat Ito-san to the factory owner Tanaka-san. Tanaka-san runs a high-precision metal parts factory, employs 20 people. They rely entirely on a few large contracts from a major electronics corporation.
Tanaka-san understands this relationship is hierarchical. He is the shitok. He provides quality and reliability, but the large client holds the ultimate power of decision. Now, it's late Friday afternoon.
Of course it is. The client's procurement manager calls the same dynamic as the politician submitting the late diet question. The demand is instant and unreasonable. We need the next batch a week early, and due to market pressure, we're imposing a 20% price cut immediately. For Tanaka-san, absorbing a 20% cut on a weak acceleration means the contract is now a loss leader. It means he has to cancel his entire staff's weekend, run the machines nonstop, pay high overtime rates, and probably burn out several key engineers.
But the manager doesn't even have to threaten him. The threat is implicit in the silence after the demand is made. Tanaka-san knows that if he pushes back or even asks for a small concession, the client will simply say, if you can't meet our competitive needs, we'll simply outsource this work to a cheaper competitor in Southeast Asia or a rival SME eager for the business.
That fear is the leverage.
It is.
So Tanaka-san has zero leverage. He is legally protected by the concept of fairness, yet completely vulnerable due to economic reality. He has no choice but to absorb 100% of the cost, 100% of the stress, and 100% of the necessary overtime. The large corporation gets cheaper, faster products.
And this is why understanding the shitok model is so crucial to the mental health crisis. The stress for 70% of Japan's workforce, those employed by SMEs, doesn't start with poor internal management. It starts with that single, non-negotiable, devastating phone call from a large client.
The mental health crisis is an economic function, exported instantly from the client to the supplier. This paints a dark picture of institutionalized abuse. What legal countermeasures have been attempted to balance this immense power?
Well, the main legal framework is the Subcontract Act of 1956. This act was established alongside the Anti-Monopoly Act, specifically to enforce fairness. Historically, it required prime contractors to fix payment within 60 days and provide a written document detailing the contract.
But its enforcement was often weak, right? It was more about paperwork compliance than preventing genuine coercion.
Precisely. The existence of the law didn't stop the abuse because the penalty for refusing the contract was worse than the penalties imposed by the law. The power imbalance was just overwhelming.
So what's changed?
In response to rising public and political pressure, we are seeing major legislative changes. In May 2025, a significant amendment bill was passed, and it's scheduled to take full effect in early 2026, aimed at strengthening the law substantially.
Okay, so what are the crucial changes that give this law the teeth it previously lacked?
The amendments target the mechanisms of abuse. First, they are explicitly prohibiting certain types of promissory notes and delayed payment instruments. Historically, a large client might give Tanaka-san a note promising payment in 120 days, far beyond the required 60, effectively forcing Tanaka-san to operate as an unpaid lender to the massive corporation.
And these notes are now being outlawed to ensure prompt liquidity.
That's the plan. It's a direct attack on how large corporations use their size to manipulate payment terms and cash flow.
And what else?
Second, and perhaps most importantly, the law now prohibits the unilateral determination of payment amounts without genuine negotiation. This directly addresses the 20% price cut on Friday scenario. It mandates that any change in price must be agreed upon by both parties, moving the process away from dictation toward collaboration, at least on paper.
And then there's the issue of absorbing external economic shocks. The rising cost of labor, raw materials, energy. This is the holy grail of the new amendments. Ensuring the pass-through, or tenka, of those increased costs. Currently, if copper prices double, Tanaka-san absorbs the entire cost, or he goes bankrupt. The new law aims to mandate that large prime contractors negotiate in good faith to share or transfer those cost increases to the ultimate customer. If Tanaka-san can now demand that the electronics firm accept a higher price because of rising material costs without fearing immediate contract termination, that fundamentally shifts the risk allocation in the entire supply chain.
It is a profound structural challenge to the traditional Shitok power dynamic. And while this is happening, there is a symbolic yet culturally significant change in terminology. The pejorative term for subcontractor, shiteyuka jigisha, carries the connotation of being below. The government is replacing that term with the neutral, more dignified, small and medium-sized and trusted business operators. It's an attempt to recalibrate the cultural perception that the subcontractor is inherently inferior. Changing the law is one thing and changing the language is another, but both run headfirst into the most resilient barrier of all: the ingrained cultural mentality that dictates how work is done and how power must be respected. Let's move to the core cultural blocks that frustrate formal legal and economic reform. We've discussed the political and economic systems that force overwork. Now we look at the cultural operating system that overrides any attempt to fix it. Government-mandated work-style reform policies, posters about no overtime, mandatory vacation days, they often look great on corporate websites.
But the moment these policies are challenged by client demand, they just vanish into thin air. Let's look at Miki's story again, the young advertising professional. Her agency had adopted the reforms enthusiastically, complete with the no overtime after 8 p.m. posters. Miki was genuinely hopeful. She believed she could finally have a life outside of the office. But at 7:55 p.m., just 5 minutes before the deadline, the client called. Of course, a major last-minute pivot requiring a completely new campaign presentation ready for 9 a.m. the following day. Miki's manager, standing next to the work-life balance poster, just sighed and spoke the words that end all reform. Okyaku-sama wa kami-sama desu. The client is God. That one phrase contains more power than the entire body of labor law and government reform combined. It is an unassailable cultural commandment that subordinates any concept of internal efficiency or worker welfare to the external demand of the client. The 8 p.m. rule evaporated instantly. Miki and her team stayed until 4 a.m. And here's the sociological punchline. The next day, the company didn't celebrate their rapid output. They celebrated their gambaru, their spirit, their guts, their willingness to sacrifice sleep and health. This demonstrates that the system fundamentally rewards the appearance of sacrifice over actual, sustainable, efficient results. The mental health crisis is sustained by praise. This directly leads us to the sociological driver. Japan operates as an input-oriented society. If you reward gambaru, the effort, rather than the outcome, the incentive is always to demonstrate effort. Exactly. In an input-oriented system, rewards, pay, promotion, status are based heavily on observables, loyalty, commitment, and crucially, time spent at the desk.
Under the traditional seniority-based pay structure, known as nenkudoretsu, rewards increase with years of service, which is simply the purest measure of unwavering commitment and time input.
And the research bears this out. If you ask regular full-time employees in Japan what factors affect their promotion and pay, they cite working hours and years of service more frequently than individual ability or demonstrable outcomes. That's the inverse of what you would expect to see in a purely performance-driven Western corporate culture.
This preference for time input over measurable output has deep historical roots, particularly for white-collar workers, the Sarari man. Their output innovation, strategy, consensus building was historically difficult to quantify precisely. So, time served became the most reliable, easily observed signal of value and dedication to the firm.
And once time becomes a currency, it leads to massive signaling and peer pressure. Overtime isn't just necessary work, it's a strong, positive signal of one's diligence and commitment to the collective.
And the reverse is devastating. Returning home early, leaving at 5 p.m. when others are still working, is often interpreted as a negative signal, a lack of commitment, or a failure to shoulder one's share of the burden.
This is the engine of tsukeizangyo, or collective overtime.
Right. The work may be done, but the employee feels psychologically compelled to stay until the manager or key colleagues leave.
It's a self-imposed prism based on group awareness and rigid hierarchy. It's not about completing the task, it's about demonstrating you tried hard enough, and that means being present.
And the perfect cultural illustration of this input orientation is inamori, or dozing, which is widely tolerated in public life, including in the diet, on trains, and in long meetings.
Why is it tolerated?
Because inemery is culturally interpreted as proof of Ganbaru. The person is so physically exhausted because they have worked so hard that they collapsed briefly.
So instead of seeing it as a sign of inefficiency or lack of sleep health, society accepts that sleep deprivation is a positive badge of honor, proof of dedication.
The system manages to turn a negative physical outcome into a positive social signal. That is a deeply resilient cultural block to structural reform. It absolutely is. And this inefficiency is amplified by the last major factor, ambiguous job descriptions. The prevalence of implicit employment contracts means job descriptions are unbounded. The fundamental understanding is that the employee must follow any directive, even if it is completely irrelevant to their core professional function.
This means the highly specialized professional, the engineer, the accountant, the policy specialist, is constantly diverted into non-core duties.
Exactly. You can't say, that's not in my contract. The implicit contract is the commitment to the company's entire needs. This requires the engineer to coordinate the annual company trip, the accountant to serve as a designated driver, or the policy analyst to spend hours reserving prime spots for the Hanami party.
Cherry blossom viewing.
Right. And this lack of specialization creates incredible internal inefficiency, which then necessitates more time input, more long hours.
The educational system's a tragic example.
It is. Japanese junior high school teachers work significantly longer hours than the OECD average, yet only about 1/3 of their time is dedicated to actual teaching. The rest is consumed by administrative duties, organizing extracurricular clubs, managing PTA meetings, and even cleaning the school.
This lack of specialization and clear boundaries is a massive structural contributor to the long workday. The system demands highly educated professionals spend 2/3 of their time on tasks that could be done by specialized support staff. So the loop is complete. Ambiguity of roles prevents measurable output. This ambiguity allows clients and politicians to demand limitless input, and the culture rewards the physical input, the time spent over actual output and efficiency. The solution clearly cannot just be about changing overtime hours. It must be about changing the definition of the employment contract itself.
That brings us directly to the current structural debate. Recognizing that the traditional employment system is broken, it creates a massive destabilizing gap between regular workers and non-regular workers. Policymakers have proposed the hybrid status of limited regular employment, or Gentai Seishin.
The gap between the Mugentai, the unlimited traditional regular worker, and the Hiseki, the non-regular precarious worker, is huge. Non-regulars now account for almost 40% of the labor force, creating immense social anxiety and income inequality.
Gentai Seishin is intended to bridge that gap. It offers the stability and benefits associated with regular employment status, but with specific agreed-upon limits.
What kind of limits?
They can be geographic. The employee will never be transferred outside a specific region. They can be time-based, guaranteeing fixed working hours and low or zero overtime. Or they can be duty-based, limiting the employee only to their specific job description. On the surface, it seems like a perfect solution for the demographics the system fails the most. Women seeking to balance career and family, young people who don't want the intense demands of the traditional contract, and older workers seeking stability without the grueling pressure. That is the official narrative. However, the proposal has unleashed intense stakeholder conflicts because it fundamentally challenges the legal and cultural foundation of long-term employment. Let's look at the business side first, represented by Kaidanren, Japan's powerful business federation.
Kaidanren strongly supports Gentai. What is their primary motivation, beyond just simple flexibility?
They see it as a necessary reduction of risk associated with the traditional, expensive lifetime employment model. If they hire a Mugentai employee, they shoulder a massive, almost lifelong commitment. Gentai allows them to lower labor costs, target specialized skills efficiently, and increase labor mobility within the firm.
They argue this is essential for Japan to compete globally against more flexible labor markets.
They do. And they are also pushing for white-collar exemptions, similar to U.S. law, to avoid overtime pay for highly skilled staff entirely.
Which is a massive contradiction, isn't it?
It is. They argue that high-paid, specialized professionals should be rewarded for output, not time, and thus should be exempt from work-hour regulations. But the Japanese system is fundamentally seniority and input-based. If you grant an exemption based on a U.S.-style performance metric, how do you prevent abuse when the underlying pay structure is based on years of service, not quarterly performance?
Kaidanren has not adequately addressed how to implement a fair exemption system without fundamental payroll overhaul.
No, they haven't.
Now for the opposition, the traditional labor unions and the political left. They view Gentai not as a bridge, but as a poison pill. Why?
They argue it's a deliberate, tactical erosion of traditional rights. The term Seishin regular employee carries immense legal protection against arbitrary dismissal. Labor fears that by creating a limited category, companies will have an easier time terminating employment.
So if a worker's hired Gentai only for the Tokyo office, and the company decides to close the Tokyo office,
the company can terminate that worker far more easily than a traditional Mujintai employee who could be transferred anywhere. It creates a new, lower tier of regular employment that is still precarious, effectively weakening the entire working class by creating internal competition among tiers.
unlimited traditional workers against limited regular workers against non-regular workers.
Right. It weakens collective bargaining power and increases employer control over tenure and roles.
And women's groups, who you'd think would be celebrating the flexibility, also have serious reservations.
Their concern is rooted in the gendered reality of Japanese corporate life. Since the traditional career track still requires the masculine ideal of unlimited dedication transfers, all-nighters, Tsukiai Zangyo women who opt for Gentai status will automatically be slotted into lower-paying secondary roles.
So they fear Gentai will normalize a system where women earn 70–80% of their male counterparts' wages, effectively institutionalizing indirect gender discrimination while maintaining the male hegemony at the top career track.
And this debate is rife with semantic conflict. Opponents highlight the fundamental contradiction in the term Gentai Seishin itself.
Because Seishin implies unlimited, and Gentai means limited.
It is a deliberate contradiction. In Japanese, Seishin implies unlimited membership and unconditional status. To pair it with Gentai is to create a legal oxymoron. Opponents argue this semantic confusion is a subtle but intentional strategy to erode the legal and cultural foundations of long-term employment protection, making all workers more vulnerable by gradually redefining what regular stability means.
Given this immense pressure and semantic chaos, how is the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare, the MHLW, navigating the reform process?
The MHLW recognizes the need for variation, but has acted as a stabilizer against radical, chaos-inducing reform. They successfully pushed back against the most aggressive proposals from business, such as establishing special dismissal zones that would have gutted core labor laws. They are pursuing incremental reform.
What does that incremental reform look like in practice?
Their focus is currently on leveling the playing field for the existing Hizeki workers. For instance, removing the unlimited contract requirement as the only barrier to equal pay for equal work among some non-regulars. While positive, the impact is expected to be minimal initially, perhaps affecting only about 100,000 workers.
A knowledgeable audience would recognize that this incremental approach, while safer, means the core structural issue, the massive input-based demands of Mujintai employment, remains untouched.
That's right.
So the structural debate is a high-stakes war over the definition of security in the Japanese workplace. Now let's return to the government sector Kasumigaseki. Because the work crisis there is so severe, it's threatening the basic function of the state itself. The situation in the government bureaucracy has reached a crisis level that impacts national security and policy efficacy. We mentioned the mental health leaves, but the statistics are startling. Young officials in their 20s resigning have quadrupled in the last 6 years. Quadrupled.
They are reporting 80 or more hours of unpaid overtime per month. The brightest young talent is fleeing the government because the workload is impossible.
The motivation for administrative reform is no longer staff welfare. It's maintaining the capacity of the state to govern. The bureaucracy is so overworked by political shit-talk demands that it lacks the cognitive space and time to create the thoughtful, long-term policies Japan desperately needs.
Exactly. Their ability to conduct independent research, devote time to strategic thinking, and gather information without external pressure is non-existent. They are constantly reacting to political deadlines. To correct this, significant administrative reforms are necessary.
Let's start with the fundamental reducing unnecessary work in a system built on paper.
This is immense. It requires an immediate top-down mandate to go fully paperless. In Japan, documentation is often tied to the Hanko seal culture, where documents must be physically carried around the office for dozens of department heads to affix their seal. This seal tour is notoriously inefficient.
So reforms must inventory all operations to eliminate checks for obsolete documents and immediately utilize external resources for non-core administrative tasks that distract officials. We need to eliminate procedural waste that acts as structural friction.
Second, reforming human resource quotas, which were tied to years of austerity. For decades, administrative reforms mandated continuous staff reductions as a cost-saving measure. Now the government simply doesn't have enough bodies for the workload. The MHLW needs to suspend these staff reductions immediately. Crucially, they must make workloads visible across departments and ministries, allowing for personnel to be reallocated based on proven need and merit, rather than arbitrary fixed quotas that haven't been updated in years. And the third reform addresses the root cause of the Takaichi incident and Ito-san's exhaustion: diet reform. This is politically the hardest reform to achieve, yet arguably the most vital. The diet must enforce deadlines for question submissions. The proposed mechanism is public transparency. Publicly announce the date and time of question notifications.
So this creates a public ledger of compliance and non-compliance, forcing politicians to adhere to the 2-day deadline and dramatically reducing those malicious last-minute demands that destroy bureaucratic work-life balance.
Without this, no internal reform at Kasumi Gaseki will succeed.
If we step back, these administrative fixes deal with the infrastructure. But what about the broader sociological solutions needed to defeat the input-oriented culture?
The single most important sociological shift is the structural move from input to output orientation. This requires implementing fully functional merit or performance-based systems that genuinely reward productivity. We need a system that rewards an employee for achieving the same or better results in 20 hours rather than 40 hours.
And this ties directly back to defining roles, which is currently resisted.
Absolutely. We must clarify job boundaries, specify duties and responsibilities, and create specialization. We need specialized administrative support staff for teachers so they can concentrate on teaching. We need specialized roles for government staff so they aren't bogged down in logistics.
This reduces the burden of non-core work on highly paid professionals and increases overall institutional efficiency.
It does.
And how do you defeat the massive peer pressure, the Tsukiyai Zangyo?
That requires top-down leadership modeling. It's the only thing powerful enough to overcome peer pressure. Managers must not only prioritize shorter hours, but must actively model appropriate behavior. If the CEO or the department manager leaves on time, takes their full paternity leave, and enforces a strict no after-hours email policy, it legitimizes everyone else doing the same.
Without that role modeling, the cultural pressure remains insurmountable.
It does. And finally, addressing the gendered element of the long workday. The long workday is structurally tied to the traditional male breadwinner model. This model equates masculinity, commitment, and career success with physical presence and unlimited hours, relying on a spouse to handle all domestic and childcare duties.
So real change requires shifting social norms by enforcing and encouraging men to take substantial paternity leave.
It demands a societal revision of the accepted definition of masculinity, ensuring that opting out of long hours is no longer viewed as a negative signal or a lack of commitment, but simply as a rational choice for work-life balance.
This has been an exhaustive look at what is often misdiagnosed as merely a cultural failing. It's a systemic pathology that relies on weaponizing power dynamics, from the politician abusing procedural rules to the large corporation abusing the shit-talk structure.
It is a perfect feedback loop. The systemic pathologies create the environment, and the persistent cultural insistence that the appearance of sacrifice fueled by the client is God mentality is more valuable than actual efficiency or sustainable work ensures that reform efforts like work style reform and new employment categories are constantly undermined.
The push for structural change, whether through the Subcontract Act amendments or the creation of Gentai Seishain, is locked in a long-running war between capital demanding flexibility and labor fighting for security. The use of semantic contradiction like limited regular employment is a powerful tool to increase employer hegemony and erode traditional protections.
Until the fundamental act of saying no to an unreasonable, abusive demand can be done without carrying a massive professional penalty, the systems designed to protect workers will remain irrelevant, guaranteeing that the 3 a.m. work session remains a persistent and likely reality for millions of people across Japan, whether they are in government or in the smallest subcontracting factory.